welcome everybody to the first Geospatial Forum of the spring semester. I'm Ross Mintermeyer, Director of the Center, and I'm thrilled to host today's guest, or speaker, Dr. Adam Tyrando. Though he's not a guest, actually. He's a faculty fellow of the Center and research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey and the Southeast Climate Science Center right here at NC State. We also have another geographer amongst us. Adam received his PhD in geography from Penn State. So he's involved in a lot of interdisciplinary work, is what that usually means. And his work focuses on the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and the complex human-environment relationships that drive those processes. So, for example, I know from personal experience, Adam working with some of my graduate students or our graduate students, he's working on coupling the center's futures urbanization model with other dynamic models of environmental change that are being applied to the whole mega region of the Southeast. Hopefully I'm not stealing too much of your thunder, but you're focusing
Not talking
on
about that at all today.
And the title of his talk is Deep Dives into Climate Model Downscaping. Do higher resolution models help us better adapt to climate change? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Adam Tyrando.
Great, thanks, Ross. So thanks for having me, and I'll just start off. This is when I curse PCs for cutting off my slide title, but other than that, should be good to go. So I'm going to start off with the gist of the talk first, and there's three key takeaways I think that I'm going to argue today. One is that high resolution climate modeling in 4D space, so space and time, is expensive. I think that's pretty well known, but it's also highly sought after in adaptive management contexts. The utility of high-resolution climate modeling depends on its purpose, and so we can maybe think of these as, are we looking for something that helps us build insight versus something that can actually make really good predictions? And this utility, that makes it harder to quantify for biological resource decisions compared to global scale decisions. And then finally, there are ways that we could do this valuation of utility. There are some techniques that we can use, but we have to first make explicit some things that are currently implicit assumptions in how we go about using climate modeling to help us make better decisions. So I always like to start in just reminding us where we are as a species and a planet. We're in this age now that we call the Anthropocene, in terms of humans are now altering just the fundamental global biogeochemical cycles on the Earth. We're really the dominant drivers of many global processes. So here's, of course, is changing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the past 800,000 years. And we can then see that this is really the dominance of our actions from burning fossil fuels relative to, say, natural forcings that act on the planet. And we know why this is. So some would argue, when did this age actually start? If you talk to Bill Rodeman, he might say it was 10, 15,000 years ago, whenever humans started with agriculture. But we also know this is accelerating now due to not only things like agriculture, but obviously just the burning of fossil fuels ever since the Industrial Revolution. And that then goes into our energy generation as well as transportation systems. And so there's consequences to this, right? The biggest one being climate change and increasing temperatures, a warming planet. And we have consequences now. We have seen this warming, and we expect more consequences in the future in terms of things like sea level rise that could really have a large impact on our society. So what's been the scientific response to this? So this is just a quick Web of Science search that I did on search terms. On the top here in the dashed line is just looking at climate change plus impacts. And then on the solid line is climate change plus adaptation. And so you can really see after we identified human combustion of fossil fuels as a problem in terms of its effect on the climate, the scientific community really started to respond quite rapidly in terms of identifying what are the consequences of us emitting all of these fossil fuels and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. UNFCCC, that's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's where the entire world got together and decided that it was our duty to avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change. That's where we get the whole Paris Agreement, 1.5 degree, 2 degrees Celsius type of agreement. We're not going to try to warm the planet any more than that. And so we've evaluated all these costs of climate change in terms of the impacts of climate change on this, that, or the other thing. We still haven't really done anything about it, and there could be good reasons for that. It's hard. Change is hard. Change can be expensive. Here's showing the costs of the sort of damages of different forms of energy generation, and basically this is the blue is the cost and the yellow is the actual cost if you talk about all of the externalities that are associated with it. And so what does that result in? Well, that could mean that if you actually wanted to pay the cost to fill up your tank, you should really be paying about $6 or maybe $8 a gallon instead of what we typically pay here. So that makes it hard to take on all of this great scientific knowledge we've produced in terms of what should we do about it. We know that there's these externalities to dealing with climate change, but that costs a lot of money. So one way to think about this, though, as we keep going forward in the future and looking at studying climate change and its effects on society and the environment, maybe this is kind of a global accounting exercise just in terms of cost benefits. So that's what I think about when I think about what is the decision for climate change and our global economy and what we're really using climate models for. That's what climate models have been really used for in the last, say, generation or so. So we think about what are the consequences of global climate change, and then we say, why do we want to know what the consequences of global climate change are? It's so we can decide if we want to put a price on carbon. But because it's so hard to put a price on carbon, we're now seeing climate change every day. We have warmer years. Every year is warmer than the last. We have all these other impacts, sea level rise, melting glaciers, etc. And so we've now moved into this next stage where we can't just say, we're going to avoid climate change. We know we now have to adapt. We're going to have to cope. We're going to have to adapt. And that's a different set of decisions than, say, the decision, which is global in scope, versus many, many decisions, adaptation and coping decisions, which are typically local in scope. And so that's when we typically put these in different boxes of, are we talking about mitigation or are we talking about adaptation to climate change? So this adaptation part is then where my science center comes in, the Southeast Climate Science Center. We are squarely in that box of, all right, how can natural resource managers better manage for a warming planet? So if you're talking about different critters or different ecosystems and you are currently, say, a wildlife manager, refuge manager or something like that, how can you, going into the future, what's the best way to adapt to this changing climate? So these are our stakeholders then for the Climate Science Center. You know, it's charismatic megafauna, or it's like the guy with the drip torch there down at Fort Bragg. So really biological resource managers trying to think about how climate change is going to affect their job and how they can still accomplish their mandate. And so we then ask questions like, what does climate change mean? Can we cope? Can we adapt? And so part of what I do then is try to combine things from the climate modeling world and the field ecology world to understand how these biological resources will respond to changes in climate, and then come up with strategies that decision makers and managers can use in response. So again, I look at the results of climate modeling. I am not a climate modeler. You go to Walt if you're a climate modeler. Just to remind everyone what we're talking about, when we talk about climate models, these are really complex, basically systems of equations that you're trying to solve. They're physical models, they're numerical models, and they're taking your basic equations of state of the atmosphere and things like conservation of momentum, conservation of mass, conservation of energy, and you're trying to then take all that information you have and solve at individual grid points across the Earth. You sort of discretize the Earth into a grid, and you solve at every time step in 4 dimensions across space and up in the atmosphere and across time. Okay. So GCMs are really expensive to run. They get more and more complex with every generation of new GCMs, again, global climate models. And they're great for some things, right? So GCMs, they're great for, again, addressing the decision as to what should we do about carbon. Because you can then run them in the future under different scenarios of carbon emissions, and you can say, well, if we're going to emit this much carbon in the future, basically as much as we're doing now, what are the consequences of that for temperature, sea level rise, precipitation globally? Even down to, say, the continental level here. You can get an understanding of what different levels of greenhouse gas emissions might mean. So again, good for this when we're talking about a decision that's global in scope. Here we're looking at detection and attribution. So if we're detecting a signal, can we actually attribute it to human actions? And global climate models are great for that. But when we go down to the local scale, they're not so great. Okay, so maybe you're looking at, say, drought and how will drought affect a particular reservoir. Say in agriculture, is this crop still going to be viable 20, 30 years from now? Maybe you're a wine grower out in California. You want to know if you're still going to have a viable career in that. Or ski slopes up in New England or North Carolina. I assume that's an endangered industry in North Carolina at this point. And so global climate models are not really great for that. Here's our first look at a place where I work a lot, which is Puerto Rico, just to get your bearings. So these are the Eastern Antilles, and this is the Caribbean Sea, Atlantic Ocean. There's Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Florida poking out there. I assume everyone's pretty familiar with this area now, especially after Hurricane Maria last year. So GCMs, climate models, they have a very coarse resolution. They really just can't resolve the island. So if this is like an estimate of precipitation across the island, this like one grid box would be how they resolve Puerto Rico. It's just one number for the entire island. Okay. And this inability to resolve processes at a subgrid scale level, this is like well known. We can see other areas where this might happen. And for example, if you're looking at up in lake effect snow, again, this grid box, if you're looking at a climate model, might have one value of, say, estimating precipitation across this entire area, but we know there's a lot of variability that goes on in there because there's different subgrid scale processes that the model can't resolve. This is a really well-known problem. We see this in geography. I call it the aerial unit problem, the ecological fallacy, or change of support, all terms maybe you're familiar with. So that's then where, I guess about 25 years ago, then people started coming up with this term called downscaling. And as a way to sort of get around this problem of coarse scale global climate models not being able to resolve fine scale processes. And we actually have this definition for it. Downscaling, just the process of making the link between the state of some variable representing the large space and the state of some variable representing a much smaller space. And there's lots of different ways that you can get at that and do that. And typically this is when I talk about the difference between, say, dynamical downscaling and statistical downscaling. But I'm not going to go into all that today. But just know there's lots of different ways to do it. And today I'm mainly going to be talking about what we call dynamical downscaling, which is basically running a higher resolution climate model embedded inside the coarse scale global climate model. So how do we use this in Puerto Rico, this downscaling? Well, I'm going to go into a case study here now about how we've been tackling this. Our motivation for considering the use of downscaling was we wanted to inform adaptive management decisions, and we wanted to be able to use higher resolution and ecologically relevant climate model projections that could actually help us make better decisions because they were able to resolve the processes going on across the island of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, just so you know, it's about 100 miles wide and about 30 miles, or 100 miles long and about 30 miles wide north to south. And so why do we want to do this? Well, there's an amazing amount of just really unique wildlife on the island, for an island of that small anyway. It's situated in the subtropics at about 18 degrees latitude. One thing we're really interested in is amphibians. There's 25 species on the island, and 2 are endangered right now. 14 species are at risk. They're really cute. And what we're concerned about, again, one thing that GCMs can help us with is understanding really large-scale patterns of change. And one thing that we have fairly robust results is this concept of subtropical drying. Now, this is really still pretty hotly debated in terms of where this drying would occur in the subtropics, but at least over areas like the subtropical Caribbean, there is this kind of consistent result of global climate models showing significant drying into the future. So the question is, like, you know, well, how will this subtropical drying, should it occur, affect amphibians on the island? Okay, again, a lot of variability in terms of ecosystems across Puerto Rico. We have dry forests, this is actually rainforest, this is El Yunque rainforest or the Caribbean National Forest. Dry forest on the southern part of the island, and then you get some things in between. Maybe this will, if we start having a lot of drying on the island, is this type of habitat going to become much more widespread, which may be less desirable for the species at risk. So again, we see there's a lot of variability in climates across the island. This is showing average annual precipitation. And you can see up here in the rainforest, you're getting over 3,000 millimeters of precipitation a year. And then down here in the driest part of the island, it says less than 1,000, and it's really more like 700-800 millimeters of precipitation a year. So a pretty wide range, and a lot of that's driven by the dominant trade winds that are kind of going from northeast to southwest across here. And then there's also a central mountain range then as well. So we're working in this area in the western part of the island, and you see what we span these different habitats and ecosystems going from subtropical wet forest all the way down to the subtropical dry forest. And you see this, you think this might be spanning a big region, but actually if you were like to just drive from here to here, it's about 7 miles. So it spans really short distances. You're getting a lot of variability in the habitats that exist here. And so then the broader conceptualization of what we're trying to do here is sort of track the climate and take on different adaptive management strategies that will give these critters a shot if it does start to dry out. So and there's different ways we could do that. So where the models help us is maybe figuring out how wide this sort of adaptive space is, and that comes from the ecology side of things, like how much tolerance do these species have. And so that will then help define their vulnerability. And then also, what's the trajectory of this space? And that's so then looking at the climate modeling and saying how will the anthropogenic forcing affect things on the ground in Puerto Rico? So then ultimately, what we're trying to do is evaluate candidate strategies for adaptive management. And that's where then you can do things like you could just actually pick them up, the frogs, and move them to a different habitat, or you could try a captive breeding, or you could do habitat acquisition. All these different things are sort of the menu of options you might have. You're trying to think about which ones of these might work best depending on what's going to happen in the climate, with the climate. But for this to work, we need to, again, sort of link the climate and the ecology and the biology. So in this case, we need information about what that climate response function of the species and systems of interest actually is. And so different species might be sensitive to different aspects of climate. You would expect this, right? So some species, depending on where they are, they might be actually pretty sensitive to changes in soil moisture in a particular season or not. Maybe that's when they lay their eggs or something like that, or when the eggs hatch. Or you might be sensitive to rainfall in a particular month, or actually like the height of a cloud layer. There's actually cloud forests up at El Yunque that are sensitive to the height of clouds. And if that cloud layer lifts, then that's actually reduces a significant contribution of moisture to their annual moisture budget. So we're trying to link these exposure and response functions. So if you're exposed to a certain type of climate and that climate changes, then how does the species or how does the system respond? Okay? And so you might have two different sites, and you say you can understand what the risk of extinction is today. Does that risk change in the future under climate change? So again, we're trying to link the climate modeling with the field ecology. And the Climate Science Center, we've funded two different projects under this rubric. One is to actually undertake climate model downscaling, and the other one is a sort of a series of field work and field experiments evaluating what those climate response functions are for different frogs. So again, why are we using the downscaling? Well, if we assumed it was something like this is kind of like what you would expect from the global climate model if it just had one result for the entire island. Everything's just kind of moving across the island the same way into the future, let alone whether it has any skill or ability or not to actually simulate the actual local climate of Puerto Rico. What we're hoping is that from downscaling, we can understand if something like this might happen, where you get different responses across the island because it's able to resolve what's going on much better than, say, with a coarse scale global climate model. So what we're looking for are climate model projections that reflect reality, given the constraints of the broader climatic changes that the GCMs can inform us about. And for our frogs, we're actually interested in simulating precipitation above everything else, as well as a few other covariates, and what that response will be to the anthropogenic forcing. Okay. And to do this, one thing that we are doing that typically is not done a lot in these climate modeling experiments is we actually go to the biological and ecological experts and the managers first to understand, well, what sort of information is really most useful to help you make decisions. Okay, so we are using this dynamical downscaling, and there's an example. You can see what it looks like as we start embedding these higher and higher resolution models in our coarse scale, using inside of our coarse scale model output. We're going down to 2-kilometer horizontal resolution with hourly outputs, and we use a couple of different RCM as regional climate model, and global climate model combinations. So we use two regional climate models, the Weather Research and Forecasting model, the WRF model, very well known around these parts, and then another model called the Regional Spectral model that's has another model nested inside of it. So just going quickly through this is kind of our experimental design. Because it's expensive to run climate models, these dynamically downscale climate models, we don't have the luxury of, say, having 20 or 30 climate model runs, so we had to kind of pick and choose how we were going to embed our high resolution models inside the coarse scale global climate models here. Okay? And then we kind of try to get some sort of representative coverage across these, and then at least one comparison between both of the regional climate models so we can see how well they're, or how they are responding to the same set of forcings. So we have 3 global climate models, 2 regional climate models, and we're looking at 2 20-year periods. Look at the past, we look at the future. We choose a future period that's relevant for management because they want to know more what's going to happen 20 to 50 years from now. They don't really care as much about 100 years from now because we'll all be dead and federal budgets don't work like that. And so then what you get out of it, out of the dynamical downscaling, is you get all these different potential variables that you could be looking at. And the problem then is that all those variables, it's a big data problem, right? So out of these climate models, if you're talking about the time steps of very, very small time steps to run the models, and you have very high spatial resolutions, that's like terabytes and petabytes worth of data. So we can't retain all of that. So that's then why we had this workshop with our stakeholders and experts on the ground in Puerto Rico to figure out, well, for the types of decisions you are going to be making and and if you're going to be adapting or coping with climate change, what sort of climate variables are useful? So we went through this ranking process to figure out, okay, what should we actually retain? And then we got these lists of downscale climate variables. This actually helped the climate modelers a lot and was something they hadn't gone through before, this sort of process. And they found it really valuable because it did help to really strip down what they had to retain throughout the length of this project, going from well over a petabyte of model output to less than 20 terabytes, much more manageable. Okay, and so then you get results. You get your much higher resolution estimates of how, say, temperature is going to change. One thing you notice is you can start to see maybe differences across the island depending on if you're in the mountains or around the coast. Precipitation change, warm colors means drying, so we do see this drying across the island, not surprising again because the large scale circulation is still driving what's happening locally, but what you do notice is that there are differences across the island depending on what model you use and depending on where you are on the island. Okay. And then we can also get things like other variables that maybe you wouldn't normally think about, but that are still very important from an ecological perspective, things like soil moisture or soil or ground heat flux, things like that. Low-level cloud fraction as well. Okay, so that's the climate modeling part. That's how we're using that to help make better decisions. The field ecology part, then, well, we still need to figure out what are the actual environmental limits or thresholds of these species. So, you could maybe think of this, if you're thinking of this like a Bayesian framework, like what's our prior on how sensitive these species are to different aspects of climate. And so the idea is we go out in the field, we design some experiments that get us some data and help us understand, and then we can get a posterior estimate, a posterior distribution of how sensitive these are. Maybe they're not sensitive at all to some of these, but we at least will have better information on how we can manage for a changing climate. So one way we get at this is, first of all, just to see like where these things live, what sort of habitats they're in, or how deeply into that dry forest are they going, or how deeply into that really wet montane upper elevation forest are they going. So we use these acoustic recorders to estimate the occupancy of some of these species, and we look across different environmental gradients. And then we basically record their calls, and then we see like, okay, we can identify different frog calls, and so we have an estimate then of where these things are living across the island. Then we can tie that, once we have that estimate of occupancy, we can tie that then to our predictions of change, okay? And ultimately then give our stakeholders and managers a better idea of what the future holds for these species, okay? So that's how we're trying to combine these ecological models and climate models to develop adaptive management strategy. But, all right, final part of the talk here. There is an important question that remains. This is really cool stuff, and I'm really happy that I got to spend all of your tax dollars doing this climate modeling and this field ecology. But still the question remains, downscaling is really expensive. Climate modeling is really expensive. Can it actually help us make better decisions? Okay? So to think about this, I'm working on a toy problem right now looking at the endangered Puerto Rican parrots. Okay, so this is still a work in progress, but just to give you an idea of how we're thinking about this. The Puerto Rican parrot, it's endemic to the island, had a precipitous decline in population over the 20th century. It was down to 13 individuals in 1974. This is a bird that used to live all across the island. It was everywhere, and it was down to, think about going down to 13 individuals left. So, it's so bad that it was one of the original listed species in the Endangered Species Act. And once they got down to that bad, they started doing direct interventions. They established an aviary in the Caribbean National Forest, which is up here again in the northeast part of the island, which is the wettest part of the island. And they'll have things like nest cavities that they build. They'll do all sorts of great, cool experiments to see like what their diet is, what results in higher survival rates for juveniles, all that sort of stuff. But what they found over the years was that where they actually had the aviary was a really crappy place for an aviary. It was in the wettest part of the island, but they kept having these really high mortality rates amongst the chicks. And what they were able to find was that they did see this pattern where the wetter sites, which is going from left to right here, had much lower survival probabilities, which the survival is going from left to right here, okay? And what they found was that really the chicks were kind of dying because they were getting all these parasites and all these other things that were really it wasn't good for them. And the reason they put the aviary there was because that was just the biggest public land they had left. So they were kind of stuck. But what ended up happening is they're in this kind of like hole now. It's like a biological sink where it's really the worst habitat you could have for these parrots. But since they have all this scientific information, that means we actually already have really good parameter estimates on the types of climate variables that are directly linked to vital rates for this species. And so we wanted to turn this into then a question that could be related to what's the value of downscaling. And let's make this into a toy problem and say, should the aviary for the endangered Puerto Rican parrot be moved further west where it's drier, or should it remain in place in anticipation of drier conditions under climate change? This is not the way you usually think about a climate change decision, but in this case, if this is where the aviary is at now, one of these two sites here, you could stay there actually and just say, well, it's going to get drier, it's expensive to move and build a whole new aviary. Maybe climate change will just allow us to pocket those savings and we can just wait it out, and this will actually be a better place to raise these chicks. Or should we actually move west and get out of here and get to better conditions because we just have no hope right now? So we can then translate this into, well, what are the cost estimates to undertake this decision? Well, we know that Fish and Wildlife Service right now budgets about $1 million a year for recovery efforts at the aviary. And we can assume that it would cost at least that much to build a new facility at a new location. Okay. And we could we have estimates, we have good cost estimates of how much downscaling costs, because I wrote the proposal, right? And so we estimate that it could cost, say, $500,000 to do this, a good sort of downscaling experiment. Now, of course, you could spend $10 million and get a lot more models, but let's just, for argument's sake, say that it's $500,000. All right. Now, this is where I say we're not done yet. So I say, I'm not going to actually answer this for you today, but I'm just posing, this is how we're setting up the toy problem, and I'm going to talk about one aspect of this that we're looking at. So first of all, I want you to think through what the decision makers are actually interested in. And then secondly, we need to think about what are the set of models we have to work with without downscaling to be able to evaluate if downscaling is useful or not. So what are decision makers actually interested in? Well, they're not actually interested in say, forecasting what the average May precipitation is going, or what the May precipitation is going to be in, say, 2035 or 2045, okay? So they're not interested in a prediction of the weather. Because presumably, they've already set up their system where they can handle variability, right? So they can withstand, say, what's going on now in terms of the climate, and the climate has variability in it. But instead, they want to know how the climate itself, that statistical definition of climate, will evolve into the future, okay? And importantly, they're also typically interested in timescales that are not crazily far out, not like 100 years out. Again, in terms of thinking about the timescale of investments that decision makers are typically making that we work with for biological resources. So this is showing just a fraction of total variance of uncertainty, and we're sort of in this area here where climate models make up the largest fraction of uncertainty. Okay. So decision makers don't need a single value forecast. They need a prediction of future climatology. And if you think about this statistically in the simplest terms, you can think about the mean and the variance, okay? And we know those can change in the future, right? So if you're going to describe, say, in a typical Gaussian distribution for temperature, both the mean and the variance, though, can change in the future. You can get changes in the variance, you can get more extremes, you can get changes in the mean, you can get changes in the mean and the variance, okay? And decision makers will want to know how that, so what are the mean and the variance of the climate going to be in the future? Second thing is, what is the sort of models we have to work with downscaling? Well, the global climate models, right? That's what we're thinking about. That's what we've been talking about the whole time. We have global climate models. This is showing all the global climate models for the entire archive that's available right now. And then the red line here is the observations. This is for May precipitation. This is what matters for this parrot, is May precipitation. And typically, when we're thinking about should we downscale or not, this is what we consider as our complete set of models. We just say, well, what are the climate models? Are they worth it? Do they help us? If they don't, then yeah, we downscale. And if we observe that GCMs can't resolve the local dynamics, then we say they're not useful for decision making. This has then generally been used as our justification for downscaling, but it involves two implicit assumptions. One, we then are saying we should give zero weight to GCMs in any actionable model of the future. By actionable model, I mean a model where we're actually going to then do some adaptive management. And you can see why that is. Like, this is all the GCMs, and none of them are anywhere really close to what the observed precipitation is for this particular site I chose. Okay. The second assumption is that GCMs are the sole class of predictive models available to us, absent downscaling. So GCMs suck, and they're all that's available. Therefore, we should downscale, right? But there actually is another class of predictive models we could be using, okay? We can actually use the observations. I think this is actually overlooked a lot of times for the types of decisions that many decision makers are making. We can use a recent statistical estimate of how climate could evolve into the future. So we could use these different observation-based models of future climate that may provide some useful information as long as the time horizon is not too far ahead, okay? So we actually have two classes of models to work with. We have GCMs and we have observations. And so under this framework, we can potentially come up with a weighted model between the two that could help us understand how useful a downscaling exercise would be. So if we make this weighted model between GCMs and observations, that can be translated into utilities, potentially into dollars, back into that $1 million to move the site, and $500,000 to do the downscaling, and that may help us decide if downscaling is worth it. So that unresolved structural uncertainty in our weighted model between the observations and the GCMs, that's sort of our maximum potential value of downscaling. And so how do we come up with these model weights? Well, I'm using a simple concept called a bounding box, introduced by Leonard Smith a while ago. And this is a nice concept because it basically just gets around the thorny issue of probabilistic predictions and whether you can actually have a PDF, probability density function. So it's just basically sort of capturing what the bounded results of your ensemble are, of whatever ensemble of models you have. And then you're just tracking where the realized climate state was. Did it fall within that bounding box? Okay. Well, in our example, oops, go back one. In our example, GCMs never resolve the observed climate state under this bounding box. So the bounding box would actually be down here because here's all our models, and then here's what the climate actually did. It's all up there. So the GCMs in this case, again, have a weight of 0. But you can make an ensemble of climatological models too, okay? And so I just chose 4 pretty simple models here. Instead of just assuming climate is constant through time, you don't have to assume that. You know, we could assume that there's trends in climate. You can also use things like stochastic volatility models to assume, so you don't have to assume that the variance is constant through time either. So you're getting away from sort of the stationarity assumption of time series models. Well, when you do this, and then you look at, like, if you're looking X years ahead, based on what the observations have told you, you can then figure out what the frequency of tracking within that bounding box is. So I did this for some 23 really long-term sites in the Global Historical Climate Network, just looking at annual average temperature. How well do the climatological predictions hold up? And you see if you're looking not too far ahead, then the proportion's fairly high. I actually thought it would be higher, but it's a little bit over 50% of the time you're within the bounding box. And predictably, it goes down as you go further into the future. When you look at precipitation for Puerto Rico, for our sites, much messier, which again, you would kind of expect. You would expect that precipitation, first of all, we don't have as strong of a trend in temperature, in precipitation as we do in temperature. So you get much more uncertainty about what those weights are, but you could still figure out what the weights are for an individual location. Here's another way to look at that. The blue line here would be like the median value across all the sites we have. You can also then do things like kriging or splines and then try to get a weighted surface across the island for areas where you don't have observations and say, like, well, what's sort of the skill we would expect from a climatological ensemble here. Here's 1 year ahead, and you see it's pretty high across the whole island. You look at 30 years ahead, there's some interesting patterns where elevation, it seems like there's higher frequency that's tracking that bounding box in the higher elevation zones than around the coast. So then that area that's above that curve would be the weight we give to our perfect, say our unknowable perfect model, perfect downscaling model. That's the unresolved uncertainty. Again, because in our case, the GCMs get a weight of 0 because they were never in the bounding box. And so we can use these concepts from the economics literature of the expected value of perfect information to then quantify this utility, translate those weights into utilities, and then we can figure out, well, what's the absolute best case scenario that we could hope for from downscaling. So this would represent, say, a maximum value of downscaling for any particular decision. But you have to articulate the decision, you have to articulate what models you actually have to work with. The actual value for any particular decision is going to be less than our perfect model situation, but at the same time, the downscaling can be used for more than just this decision. So that will actually increase your overall value relative to just that one decision. So for instance, you're basically providing a public good. You might want to say, use the downscaling to help you understand how climate change will affect coffee production or other things across the island. So that's all I had today. Just back to our key takeaways again, is that this stuff is, climate modeling is expensive, and sometimes it's useful. It's hard to get at whether it's useful for actually making better decisions related to climate change on the ground for local scale adaptation. But there are some methods that I think we can use, and we're working through them now, that can get us closer to evaluating if these are wise investments and what really downscaling these high resolution climate models are really useful for. That's it. Thanks.
Questions?
I'll go.
Yeah.
Someone else's.
I was waiting for a while.
So, I guess my question or comment is, so you've shown that the global climate models don't represent precipitation in your site's interest. And there's a possibility, you raised the possibility that, without really expecting your downscale model to be perfect,
Right.
that it might do a lot better.
The downscale model.
Downscale.
Yeah.
But the question is, my comment is, and I'll let you respond to what that is, but the downscale model is still being driven off of GCM,
Right.
which you've shown, so there's transmission of all kinds of information or misinformation from the
Right.
GCM scale down to the downscale.
Right. Right, of course. I mean, that's why downscaling is not perfect, right? But it doesn't mean that doesn't mean that there's no improvement. Just at the most basic level, at least the island is there. So, it can resolve local topography and how that affects then the boundary layer and when the trade would start smacking up against the island versus just over open water, where over open water you would hope the GCMs are doing, at least getting the basics right there, because there's just a much higher spatial autocovariance, if you will, spatial covariance across a flat open ocean surface than there will be across an island that has just highly variable topography, right? So yeah, that's why we say that you can't ever achieve a perfect model, and that the value will never be as high as the perfect model, but that's sort of the next step then, is the decision maker then still has to be explicit about, all right, we know this is the absolute best this is unachievable, but then I can still say, if it's better than the GCMs, how much am I willing to pay for that? Something that's sort of in between those two.
I'm curious about the things you learned from your stakeholders.
Mhm.
Are there any big groups of things that they are not interested in that everyone is modeling, or were you surprised by any of the things that?
I mean, oh sure. I mean, if you ask, an atmospheric, scientist versus like a agronomist or a biologist on the ground, they're going to be very interested in very different things. None of that was surprising. I think probably the hardest thing is always still like people it's eliciting information from experts is you probably know can be very difficult, because lots of times your stakeholders don't know what questions to ask. They don't know what they want to know or what they need to know. So there's a process to kind of get through that and walk through, like, well, how does this system actually work? And what don't we know? What are our known unknowns and all that, the Rumsfeldian type of process you have to go through. And that takes a lot of patience. That was probably the biggest thing, yeah.
Did you find it that you had kind of end products, like you want to
Yeah.
And then you mapped back
Yeah.
what that.
Yep. Yep.
So the climate change part, was too fast, and the very last, one of the very last slides had 3 different images. Like there was 2 or 3 slides in a row, and were those 3 different images results of different downscaling techniques? I wasn't really clear what those results represented, because they looked significantly different.
These? No, further back.
All the way to the
Let's do this.
fonts. Yeah, those.
That one? Yeah, so these are the same regional climate model, but they're embedded in different global climate models. This is a different regional climate model embedded as in the same global climate model as this one. Okay? So these two have the same global climate model, and these two are the same regional climate model. And so, yeah, you can see there's a big difference between
Those
all
are
of
the
them.
present or the future?
These are for the future.
Oh, percentage change.
This is percentage change into the future. So the average precipitation, I think this is the wet season, averaged over 2040 to 2060 versus 1985 to 2005. So a lot of what we say structural uncertainty, just in terms of what the response will be. And this is kind of what Walt was talking about. A lot of this is like, what are they inheriting from the GCMs? Because they're still getting all the boundary conditions from the GCMs.
So I mean, if you want to do some kind of, if you want to take this data and apply it to some other field or some other analysis, how would you know which one to use?
So you don't. You don't, and this is why we never really recommend like, say, picking a best model, because you're kind of trying to sample across an unknowable future, and so you're typically trying to, why we say that's why we're trying to build an ensemble of models, so that you can sample more from what could be a future type of climate and climate change, and so that's where you get. And that's why in my little cartoon here, you're going for something like this, and then hoping that what actually happens in the future, your ensemble will have bounded that. So at least you're not as surprised, Yeah, Russ.
Adam, I really enjoyed how you contextualized the downscaling problem. My question is that I think you made a compelling case for downscaling in Puerto Rico. How would you compare the relative need for downscaling in many other parts of the world? Let's just start with North America to keep
Yeah.
it simple, like the Appalachians versus the coastal plain of North Carolina,
Right.
maybe California.
Yeah. Well, I think that what might be, again, it's the decision context is important, right? But also then, like what I'm kind of talking about here with the maybe making a little bit better use of observations that we have, particularly in places with long climate records like North Carolina, and if the lead time on the decision is not super far ahead, if there's some skill in using observations to predict the future, why not try to incorporate that? And then I would think you could get to something like this. And I know that doesn't show up very well, but you could maybe say like, yeah, actually in the mountains, climatology is a really poor predictor versus the coast, and the GCMs, and maybe vice versa. Maybe the GCMs are really doing a good job getting at the dynamics of climate in the coast or in the mountains relative to each other. So
Would you say, so clearly the GCMs are just missing Puerto Rico?
yeah.
Is it just substantially more vulnerable to that than
Yeah.
than continental areas?
Yeah, again, depending on where you are in the continental U.S. But yeah, in general, like I mean, there's things that then the GCMs still aren't going to do well with, like, changes in the track of the jet stream or things like that that may be important for, particularly at the boundaries of where you might, snowfall is an important impact in the winter, things like that. So, but yeah, there's places where GCMs, I would expect them to do better relative to than how they do in Puerto Rico. I think, and some people have obviously, people have been looking at this and say, what is the skill of GCMs in this place or that place? But maybe, I think we really should be putting a bit more effort into kind of putting it together in terms of what's the, how much skill do they actually have, and are they really sort of tracking things like we would hope they are? In some places, it's not going to. This method is still not going to be foolproof because in areas where you have really rapid climate change, it's going to be hard to sort of do any sort of look back comparison and get some estimate like that to see and compare it to the observations, the past observations. But
You have to base it on the past.
yeah, and so that it's not going to, again, you're still going to be uncertainty in that. But I think this is at least a way to try to get, a better way to try to get at that and be more explicit about our assumptions about what's good and bad in our models. Yeah.
So I think at one point you had mentioned you were running some models on an hourly time step.
Yeah.
That kind of caught my eye because that seems like a lot of data. How does the resolution of time impact your results as well, especially when you start to go out into decades and beyond?
You mean in terms of data storage or in terms of accuracy?
In terms of accuracy, are there significant differences in your times, in the results that you get when you model, say, hourly? I don't know if you do daily or weekly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually don't remember what the time step is. I think it's hourly, but some of the climate models, well, they're like minutes, right?
Oh, your regional models must have time steps. Minutes.
Yeah, it's actually minutes, and that's just because in order to have any sort of ability to keep up with sort of the, what's going on with the atmosphere, you have to have that short of a time scale. But, that's why we're not trying to forecast the weather. We're not trying to say it's going to be 60 degrees at 4 p.m. on March 1st in 2060. We're just saying what does the climate do through time, and then we're just evaluate the statistics of that. So, and that's the same for any sort of climate model experiment. So.
Well, I guess that's where I don't know climate modeling.
Yeah.
But it seems like it would reduce your cost if you modeled on a coarser time scale. But
I mean, it would, but you would not be able to accurately simulate the state of the atmosphere. Yeah.
So you're basically trying to separate weather and climate with a shorter time scale.
Well, yeah. So the climate, to get at the climate, we just climate. You can define climate in a lot of ways, but climate, you're basically just taking the statistics of something and saying what is it doing over this period. But to actually run the models, you have to do it at a very short time step.
Or the model blows up.
Or the model blows up.
That's something
Yeah.
you have a choice.
Yeah. 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 All right.
Thanks, Adam.
Okay.